The Effigy's Curse, A Haunting in the Woods. 1. The move when my husband Ben and I first moved into our cozy cabin in the woods of Oregon, we thought we'd found paradise. The air was crisp, the trees stood like ancient guardians, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. It was exactly the kind of isolation we had dreamed of. Life felt simple and serene, at least at first. We'd only been there a week when strange things started happening. It began innocently enough. The feeling of being watched when I'd hang the laundry, the rustling of bushes when there wasn't any wind. I chalked it up to wildlife, bears, deer, or maybe coyotes. But then we found the footprints. 2. The footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. Barefoot, deep imprints in the mud near the edge of the woods behind our house. What made it worse was the size of them. They were massive, easily twice the size of Ben's feet. Probably some hiker who got lost, Ben suggested, though his voice wavered. He didn't sound convinced, and neither was I. The footprints didn't lead anywhere. They started at the tree line and ended just a few feet from our house. We decided to let it go, hoping it was a one-time occurrence. It wasn't. 3. The first night. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of tapping on the bedroom window. Ben was sound asleep, snoring softly, but the tapping was rhythmic, deliberate. I froze, my heart racing, and slowly turned my head toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but the tapping continued. Gathering my courage, I reached over and shook Ben awake. He groggily grabbed the flashlight we kept by the bed and crept to the window. He flung the curtains open, shined the light outside, and there was nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the wind. "It's probably just a branch," he said, though his hands were trembling as he closed the curtains. But there were no trees close enough to the house to tap against the window. The effigy. The next morning we found it, a small, crude effigy made of twigs and string hanging from the porch railing. It was shaped like a person, with twisted arms and legs, and a head stuffed with what looked like animal fur. "This is some kind of prank," Ben muttered, though his face had gone pale. He cut it down and threw it into the fire pit. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a warning. 5. The shadow. A week later, things escalated. Ben had gone into town for supplies, leaving me alone. It was late afternoon when I saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and motionless, just watching the house. I grabbed the binoculars we kept by the window and focused on the figure. My breath caught in my throat. The face, if you could call it that, was obscured by some kind of mask or hood. It was impossible to make out any features. I blinked and it was gone. 6. The scratches. Ben didn't believe me when I told him about the figure. He said I was imagining things, that I was letting the isolation get to me. But even he couldn't explain what we found the next morning. Deep scratches marred the wooden door of our cabin. They were jagged, uneven, as though made by claws or some kind of tool. "Maybe a bear," Ben said, though the look in his eyes betrayed his doubt. We spent the day reinforcing the doors and windows, but it didn't make us feel any safer. 7. The whispering. The whispering started 2 nights later. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the more I listened, the more I realized it was voices. Low, murmuring voices, just outside the cabin. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was insistent, almost pleading. Ben heard it too. He grabbed his shotgun and went outside. But as soon as he opened the door, the whispering stopped. The woods were silent, as though holding their breath. 8. The final night. We decided to leave. Whatever was out there, we didn't want to find out. We packed our bags and planned to drive to a motel in town. But that night, something happened that I still can't explain. We were awakened by a loud, thunderous banging on the door. Ben grabbed his shotgun and shouted for whoever it was to leave. The banging stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. And then came the smell, a sickening, putrid stench that filled the cabin, making me gag. It was so overpowering that I thought I might pass out. The growling faded, and when we finally opened the door, there was nothing there. Just the same crude effigy hanging from the porch railing. 9. The escape. We didn't wait until morning. We threw our bags into the truck and sped down the dirt road, leaving the cabin behind. As we drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it, the tall figure standing in the middle of the road, watching us go. We never went back. We sold the cabin, told the buyers nothing about what had happened. To this day, I don't know what it was we encountered in those woods. Some say it was a spirit, others a deranged hermit. But I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the whispers, and that terrible, unrelenting stench. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the tapping on my bedroom window. The diary. A few weeks after we moved into the city, I stumbled upon an old diary while unpacking. It wasn't ours. The leather cover was cracked and faded, and the pages were filled with spidery handwriting. The entries spoke of strange occurrences in the same cabin decades ago. Missing animals, shadowy figures, and an overwhelming stench that would appear without warning. The final entry chilled me to the bone. It read, "He watches, always watches, and he never forgets." 11. The phone calls. It wasn't long before the phone calls started. At first, I thought it was a wrong number. Static on the other end, faint breathing. But then, a voice. Low and gravelly, it whispered, "You can't run." We changed our number, but the calls continued. Somehow, whoever it was always found us. 12. The nightmares. Both Ben and I started having the same nightmare. We were back at the cabin, the tall figure standing over us as we slept. Its face was still obscured, but now I could see its hands, long, clawed fingers reaching out. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air, only to find Ben awake too, staring at the ceiling. "It's in my dreams," he whispered one night. "It's not done with us." 13. The return. Against our better judgment, we decided to go back. Not to stay, but to gather our remaining belongings and put the place up for sale. As we approached the cabin, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. The air felt heavier, the woods darker than I remembered. When we opened the door, the stench hit us like a wall. The inside of the cabin was trashed, furniture overturned, walls scratched, and the floor littered with more of those crude effigies. We didn't stay long. As we loaded the truck, I caught a glimpse of movement in the woods. I didn't look back. 14. The mark. A few days after returning to the city, I noticed something on my arm. A mark, like a brand, in the shape of one of the effigies. I hadn't seen it before, and I had no idea how it got there. Ben had one too, on his back. We tried to ignore it, but the marks began to burn, especially at night. The pain was unbearable, as though we were being watched even from afar. 15. The encounter. One night, unable to take the burning anymore, Ben and I decided to confront whatever it was. We performed a ritual we found in the diary, using salt and candles, chanting words that felt alien on my tongue. As we finished, the air grew heavy, and the lights in our apartment flickered. The figure appeared. Not in the woods, but in our living room. Its hooded face turned toward us, and for the first time it spoke. "You trespassed," it growled, its voice like grinding stones. "You took what was not yours." 16. The revelation. Terrified, I asked what it meant. The figure raised one clawed hand, and suddenly I saw it. A memory I didn't know I had. Ben and I, laughing, digging near the cabin, finding an old rusted box filled with trinkets and bones. We thought it was a child's time capsule and had tossed it aside. But it wasn't. It was a burial site, a sacred offering. "You disturbed the balance," the figure hissed. "You must make it right." 17. The bargain. Desperate, we begged for forgiveness. The figure told us there was only one way to appease it. We had to return to the cabin and restore what we had taken. "If you fail," it warned, "you will belong to me." 18. The restoration. We drove back to the cabin, clutching the items we had taken. The woods felt alive, watching, waiting. We buried the trinkets and bones where we had found them, whispering apologies into the dark. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in around us. When we finished, the stench disappeared. The woods grew silent. The figure was gone. 19. The aftermath. We left the cabin for good, this time with a sense of closure. The marks on our bodies faded, and the nightmares stopped. For the first time in months, we felt at peace. But we've never forgotten. The woods took something from us that day. Our innocence, our sense of safety. And though the figure is gone, I sometimes feel its eyes on me, a reminder of the balance we nearly destroyed. 20. The warning. If you ever find yourself deep in the woods, be careful where you tread. Some things are meant to remain undisturbed. And if you hear tapping on your window, don't look. Some watchers never stop watching. 21. The unfinished ritual. A few months passed without incident, and we dared to believe it was over. But then, the dream started again. This time, the figure didn't just watch. It whispered to me. Words I couldn't understand, but the urgency was clear. Something was still wrong. I woke up one night, drenched in sweat, to find Ben standing at the window. He was murmuring something under his breath, staring into the darkness. When I touched his shoulder, he turned to me with a blank expression. "We didn't finish it," he said. The next morning, I found another effigy on our doorstep, smaller than before, but unmistakable. 22. The final confrontation. Realizing there was no escape, we returned to the woods one last time. Guided by the diary, we discovered something we had missed during the restoration, a second burial site hidden deeper in the woods. The items we disturbed were part of a larger ritual, a tether to keep something sealed. The moment we uncovered the site, the air grew thick, and the trees seemed to groan. The figure appeared again, its form shifting, as though barely contained. "You must finish what you started," it demanded. Ben and I worked frantically, placing the items back and completing the ritual as instructed. As we chanted the final words, the figure let out a deafening scream and dissolved into the air, taking the oppressive weight with it. The woods fell silent, and for the first time I felt they were at peace. We left and never returned, knowing we had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death.